Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this is going to be a debate, and the motion is, this House regrets the excessive spread of the English language. And as always, I shall commence as the proposition. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the House, we oppose the excessive spread of the English language for many reasons. It's imperialism of the most negative kind because it robs people of their native language and therefore of their identity. It is exacerbating and accelerating language death, and that is something we ought to rue, something we ought to strive to reverse. This leads to cultural genocide because a native speaker of a language is a living repository of so much law. It's part of our collective individuality, having a language. And there are many more reasons why it's regrettable. So it leads to people being deracinated and just creates this mishmash identity and not even speaking English properly, sometimes blending English in with an indigenous language. So it leads to all sorts of impurities. So we ought to preserve our linguistic diversity. It's a crucial part of our heritage, and every language group is a unique bearer of an identity, and each language has its own richness, has thought patterns which cannot be properly translated, and some very sparkling phrases. People can derive aesthetic pleasure from expressions which defy any proper translation. There are different ways of thinking, like for example in Chinese, a sign of the grass, which would be literally don't step on me, as though the grass is speaking to you. It's quirky and it's hilarious to an Anglophone. So it would be a pity if that were to disappear. Obviously Mandarin is the most spoken language in the world, but there would be numberless examples from less commonly spoken tongues. So there are words that we just don't have in English, and there are words in English that other languages simply don't have. Or the tu vu distinction, I'll say Russian distinguishing between a coniferous forest and a pine forest, just different words for that. English spreading too much is due to globalism, which many people regret in itself, even if it weren't for the fact that it's doing violence to other languages. We homogenize the world. We make it just so bland, so samey, too much of a melting pot. So yes, of course we should travel, we should interact with each other, but we should not be imposing the English language on people so much. In the United Kingdom, it is disgraceful that in airports the signs up are in English only. At the very least, they ought to be in the 6 languages of the United Nations. So English, French, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Arabic, because between those 6 languages, surely something like 90% of the world's population could understand one of them. It just becomes so monochrome if we're doing everything only in one language. It's part of capitalist exploitation, and then we can market things at people simply using English and forcing them to abandon their own language and converse in the English language, and often doing so badly rather than doing so in their own language perfectly. Anglicisms are used when it's unnecessary, when perfectly adequate words exist in other languages. For example, sale in German, or car sharing in Russian, dealer. Words like business, cool, stop have all been adopted by many other languages, and there's no need for that when they have serviceable words in their own language. So English should not spread so much. I'm not saying nobody should learn it or should never be used abroad, but in places like, say, Malta or the UAE, people are worried about the decline of the native language amongst the junior generation, that in 50 years, the native language might have more or less disappeared. Places like the Netherlands and Sweden are going that way. 90% of people can speak English. Often the youth speak it perfectly, which in some ways is good, but the trouble is they're switching over so much they're going to abandon their own language, and that is something to lament. So I beg to propose. Well, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I oppose this moronic motion for many reasons. English unites. A language to unite us all. Remember a young French woman saying she didn't really care which was the world language, but it's so fantastic we found a global language. It doesn't really matter where it started. It's not one country trying to lord it over the rest. It's not because we all want to obey the United States, or that the UK has a great cultural reach or anything like that. No, it could be from anywhere, but by accident of history, English has turned out to be the preponderant language of global communication. So this helps us achieve peace. We can understand each other at a literal and at a more profound level. So it facilitates communication. And that's something to be applauded. It makes business so much easier. Not just for people who are native Anglophones, but if, say, a Norwegian is doing business with a Japanese, usually they'll use English as their lingua franca. So it provides a common and neutral language for all sorts of areas of the world. So, as I say, if it was like someone from Turkmenistan speaking to somebody from Brazil, they'd probably have English as their common language, and it's not that one country is imposing it on the other. And it's actually nothing new. You look in the 19th century, certainly in the Western world, French was the lingua franca. That's why it's got the word franca. Okay, that means free, really. So even if it was Portugal signing a treaty with Denmark, they would have done it in French. And further back in the Western world, they would have done it in Latin. And in other countries, even not Arabic-speaking countries, anywhere from North Africa into South Asia, sometimes they did it in Arabic, or in South Asia, sometimes they did it in Persian. So a common language is nothing new, but just this one's global rather than continental. So it leads to greater prosperity, and it's enriched all our lives, being able to understand things, being able to speak to people with whom we previously could not converse. So mutual understanding is something to be welcomed, not something to be regretted. This pining for yesteryear, this mawkish nostalgia is contemptible. And we now have a global culture, which doesn't mean that national cultures are under threat. So we transmit cultural memes, we receive cultural memes, there are loan words, we borrow, we mix and match. And that's all splendid. Our lives are more colourful, more exciting, more exhilarating because of this cultural cross-fertilization. We shouldn't talk about purity as though another language is pollution. That's the mindset of isolationism and of xenophobia. So we should be xenophiles. We should not be decrying the fact that we gain from our interaction with other nationalities. We should celebrate this. So it's very useful for pilots at a practical level. Everybody knows pilots communicating with air traffic control in English, pilots of ships as well as pilots of planes using the language. And we all know that in airports there's very useful announcements in English, and air hostesses speaking the language. So as for language death, that occurs anyway. Countless languages have disappeared over the centuries. Nobody ever remembers what they're even called these days. So it cannot be prevented. And they can be brought back. You could look at Cornish, which went extinct in the late 18th century, was revived in the early 20th century. Or look at Hebrew. Well, it was classical Hebrew, but it wasn't a spoken language, and that was brought back. Even Latin is clung on. It's a spoken language in the Vatican. So English adopts words, and languages cannot be entirely separated from each other. They're not hermetically sealed any more than countries or cultures are. So over half English words are originally of Latin or ancient Greek origin. From Greek, they suddenly went to Latin, into Italian, into French. So you could say so much English vocabulary actually is French. The word stop was cited by the other side. Stop is French originally, estopper. So English has borrowed liberally from German, to a lesser extent Dutch. We even have Inuit words like kayak. We have lots of Hindi words like paka or tiffin or bungalow. We've got Tamil words like catamaran. We have Chinese words, things like that, feng shui. We've got Japanese words like kiroshi, kamikaze, and I could go on and on. And of course, they have taken words from English too. So the fact that we interact with each other is something we should applaud, not something we should lament. We know each other better, we comprehend each other, and that is fantastic. And we get to like each other, to perceive each other as human before, oh well, if we can't communicate, they're just so different, they're not like us. Well, human emotion is universal. I know the rules of behaviour are quite different, but this is better. Imagine not being able to communicate to people at all. Your lives would be so much worse, would be much more frustrating. So we've just got to keep talking, as Professor Hawking used to say. Jaw is better than war. as Harold Macmillan said. So we do not regret the spread of English. We should have it everywhere, which is not to say we want other languages to disappear. Some will disappear even if English doesn't spread. But so, yes, I'm not saying that every country should adopt English as their official language, and there may be times to keep languages going. Even within the United Kingdom, the Welsh language has revived remarkably. 20% of people in Wales speak it as their primary language. In the United States, many people have managed to keep Native American languages going. In Ireland, Republic of Ireland, we have the Irish language as an official tongue, and we use it at ceremonies. So it doesn't have to be either or. This is a false dichotomy. There need be no enmity between one language and the next. So that's why I say, speak English, speak your other language. They're no threat to each other. They are friends. They're not enemies. I beg to oppose.